In verse 24, Paul speaks of sexual immorality in general. And then in verses 26 to 27, he picks out homosexual practice for particular mention. Look at your text down to verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own person the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. The focus note is on sexual practices, not on sexuality as such, which of course is intrinsically good because it's intrinsically human. But the question that has exercised people, particularly in the last generation, and one that continues to do so in Christian communities all around the world, is why does Paul focus on homosexual deeds, both female and male, for particular comment? Now, this is a very sensitive issue, and opinion differs widely on why Paul critiques homosexual behaviour. It's actually one of only 6 references in the whole Bible to same-sex practices. And it's certainly in terms of trying to understand New Testament teaching, it's the most important, because the other 2 in the New Testament, the 3 in the New Testament, the other 2 are really just passing references and a whole list of other things. But here we have a rather detailed comment. And so I want to just give you some options. I'm not going to tell you what you should believe, but I'll give you the options. Some commentators think that the reason why Paul picks out homosexuality here is because of the intimate association in the Roman world, in particular in the Hellenistic world, between sexual activity and homosexual activity and pagan idolatry. So one argument is that Paul has cultic homosexuality in mind, the kind of sexual practices that took place in temples, in pagan temples. Sexual practices for, if you like, religious ends. And that's what Paul is thinking of. He's not thinking of same-sex relationships between consenting adults that are done voluntarily and in a context of love. He's thinking more of religious sexual practices. And there's a little bit to be said in favour of this, I think, because there is a parallel in the wording between verse 25 and in verse 27. In verse 25, Paul says that human beings exchange the truth of God for a lie. And then in verse 27, he says that women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, likewise men. Same verb. So maybe that's the link. Others think that what Paul is thinking of here are abusive homosexual relationships. In the Greco-Roman world, homosexual activities often took place in relationships of domination, in relationships of mistreatment, the use of prostitutes, the abuse of slaves, the abuse of children. And that Paul has kind of abusive homosexual exploitation in mind. Or perhaps he has homosexual activity that is an expression of pure lust, because in both references, people are carried away with lust and engage in such behaviour. Again, perhaps not thinking of more respectful and voluntary sexual relationships. Others think, and perhaps this is the more traditional interpretation, is that, I'll get to the more traditional one. Here's another more recent one. Others think that what Paul is referring to here are people who engage in sexual practices that are contrary to their own natural orientation. So they do something against nature. That phrase is used in this text. And the argument runs that it is perverse for heterosexuals to engage in homosexual relations, but is not perverse for homosexuals to engage in same-sex relations because it's natural for them. And there are still, in fact, I read an article just earlier in this week where somebody mounts that argument. I have to say, of all the options, I think this is the least probable, because I think that it depends on a very modern understanding of sexual orientation. Perhaps the more traditional interpretation, the most traditional, most widely supported interpretation in the past, has been that the reason why Paul, as a Jew, highlights homosexual practice is because he saw it as a distortion of the creation order, that somehow it reverses God's intentions in creating male and female for sexual intimacy with one another. Now, there are probably other interpretations. I have done quite a bit of very close work on this text, and there are no doubt other interpretations that we could look at. But whichever interpretation is to be accepted, whichever is the reason why Paul condemns same-sex practices here, I think the key point to note is that in the larger argument, it is offered as evidence for a brokenness in the human race, and some kind of damage that has been suffered by the human race as a whole. In the creation narratives, human sexuality is linked to possession of the divine image. So the text says, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. There is something about our sexuality that reflects the identity of God. Not that God is a sexual being, but God is a relational being. And sexuality permits, the sexual duality of the human race permits arguably the deepest expression of human relationality and of human intimacy that we have, and it is this that reflects the image of God. If that's so, then it's not surprising that a breakdown in humanity's relationship with God would have sexual consequences, that it would affect the imago Dei, the image of God that is reflected in our sexuality. So sexual confusion, sexual struggle, sexual brokenness in all its forms is a symptom of the human plight. And I think it just needs to be said that as the church wrestles and debates the issue of same-sex relationships today, I think we always need to be reminded, especially those of us who are heterosexual, that most of the sexual problems that afflict the human race and that afflict the church are problems that heterosexuals perpetuate, especially heterosexual men. And so to see so much riding on our attitudes towards same-sex relationships can actually distract us from what really is the big problem. Most of the problems, the big problems to do with sexuality, are actually experienced in the heterosexual community, because we're all affected by this aspect of the fall.